Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be sharing about my 4 favorite ways of shading or developing my values when painting with watercolor. This tutorial is going to include must-know information on light behavior and shading, as well as must-do exercises, at least in my opinion, for anyone just getting started with watercolor. If you're looking to learn how to shade when working with watercolor, or you're looking to improve your shading techniques, it's very important that you understand about light behavior, which light behavior is an art fundamental. And always remember that light, three-dimensional form, and value are all related. So it's important for you to understand about light behavior and about 3D form, because light is what illuminates a 3D form, and then we're able to see different values throughout our object or subject because of that light going on. Light reveals form. Always remember that. As artists working on a flat two-dimensional surface like a piece of paper or a canvas, we're observing those different values that are happening in front of us or in a reference photo that we're using, and we're trying to replicate those or develop those in our drawings or paintings, and that's what makes something look 3D. But we have to know what to look for in a reference photo or whatever it is that we have in front of us in real life, and we also have to develop our observational skills to be able to see those subtle changes in values and whatnot. Alongside this understanding of light behavior and three-dimensional form and value comes knowledge of your medium and mastery over your medium, which in this case, I'm going to demonstrate this using watercolor. Something I always advise to people getting started with any painting medium really is bringing in this understanding of light behavior, value, and 3D form, and starting to develop mastery over your medium and your technique via painting simple three-dimensional objects such as spheres, cubes, rectangular prisms, cones, pyramids, etc. Because then, once you have this knowledge and you have this understanding of how to develop a good sense of believable 3D form, depth, and dimension in a simple object, it's going to be much easier for you to do it when you're painting an actual subject, an animal, a still life arrangement, a landscape, whatever it is. All right, so with all that said, let's go ahead and jump straight in. So before getting into the actual shading of spheres and my 4 favorite ways of shading with watercolor, I do want to share this very essential exercise that anyone starting with watercolor should definitely work on. And this is just a simple value strip. So remember, all value means is the lightness to darkness of a color. Whenever you hear the term tone, it basically means the same thing as value. And when we're working with watercolor, we can create a wide range of values from super, super light and translucent to pretty dark and saturated using only one same color. All we have to do is modify the color's consistency by bringing in more paint or water into our color mixture, depending on whether we want a lighter value or a darker value. And this is imperative that you're able to do this when working with watercolor. It's one of the base skills, and it has to do with water control. As we move along in a painting process when working with this medium, we're constantly shifting and changing the paint to water ratios in our color mixtures depending on what it is that we're doing. Okay, so to explain a little bit about this exercise, I would highly recommend using a color that is darker. So a color that looks dark in the pan or when straight out of a tube is what I would recommend. Why? Because the darker the color inherently is, the wider the range of values you're going to be able to create. Imagine if I had used something like a yellow or a light orange or something like that. I wouldn't be able to develop a very, very dark, rich, deep value like this one blue allows right here. I would start already with a very light value and I would get lighter, right? I could water it down and get lighter and lighter, but I'm not going to be able to get super dark. And so I would recommend using something like a dark blue, a dark purple, a dark green, maybe even a red, or try it with a black or a Payne's gray. Just as an FYI, this is a phthalo blue that I am using from my Daniel Smith watercolor set. And then what you're gonna do with this color that you've chosen is you're gonna create a very saturated little puddle on your mixing palette. So a puddle that has a lot of paint in it and a little bit of water. Don't make a super dry color mixture that then is gonna make it difficult to paint in a shape. You definitely want some amount of water in there, but more paint than water. You want it to look super dark, rich, and saturated on your mixing palette, but you want a good amount of flow to it so that you're able to load up your paintbrush bristles and paint in this rectangle or square pretty quickly, because otherwise you're gonna be left with sharp defined edges around the shapes that you start painting in, or you're gonna be left with a lot of texture. I am using a size 14 round brush for this, which also allows me to hold a good amount of water and paint in my bristles so that I'm able to paint nice and quick. The smaller the brush, the less amount of paint and water you're going to be able to load up in those bristles, and that is going to make it so that everything has more of a chance to dry and you're left with more texture overall. As you're painting in your rectangles, I'd recommend leaving at least a sliver of dry, unpainted paper in between the two rectangles so that your color doesn't start bleeding into the next rectangle or the rectangle beside it. All right, so once I had that puddle of saturated color on my mixing palette, I loaded up my paintbrush bristles as best as I could. For this exercise, you're just loading up your paintbrush bristles once, this time in the beginning, so make sure that you load them up well. And I went ahead and painted in that first rectangle on the left. Now you can do it from left to right, right to left, whatever you'd like. It doesn't really matter. If you're a lefty, you might find it more comfortable to work right to left. But what matters here is that you're able to develop your different values and that you go gradually from darkest to lightest. So I painted in that first rectangle with that deep saturated color, and then once I was done painting that rectangle, all I did was I dipped my paintbrush in my container of water 3 times. I'm gonna go back to this part of the video and show you this footage again, because this is exactly what I'm doing in between each and every single one of my rectangles. I'm just dipping my paintbrush in my container of water 3 times. So check it out. I finished painting this first rectangle in. Finish painting it in. I do a little bit of cleanup along the edges. I then take my container of water and do 3 dips. 1, 2, 3. Remove the excess drippage from my paintbrush bristles by gently scraping the bristles along the top of my container there. And I then paint in the next rectangle. I then go through the exact same process in between each and every single rectangle without taking any more paint from my puddle on my color mixing palette. I just do the 3 dips in my water and I go ahead and paint in the next one. And then 3 more dips and I go ahead and paint in the next one. And so on and so forth until I get to the final rectangle. Now, why is this happening? Why is the paint becoming lighter and lighter? Well, I just loaded up that paintbrush once, right, in the beginning. I just grabbed that one load of paint. And every single time I dip my paintbrush in my container of water, some of that paint falls into the container of water or is getting removed from those bristles, and a bit of water is getting absorbed back into the bristles, diluting the paint in the bristles more, but paint is still there. And this is important to know. When working with watercolor, a little bit of paint goes a long way. Now, if you start painting in one of your rectangles and you notice that the color/value comes out exactly the same as the previous rectangle, there's not a difference between the two, just stop what you're doing, dip your paintbrush in your container once or twice, remove the excess water, and continue painting. That is going to help. Notice how frequently I am helping myself with my absorbent towel, by the way. I am constantly just touching the tip of my paintbrush to my absorbent towel to remove that excess paint/water from my paintbrush bristles whenever I feel that I have way too much water or paint on my paper. Support yourself with your absorbent towel to stay on top of water control. For that last rectangle, I did dip my paintbrush in my container of water, I think 2 extra times, just to remove a little bit more paint from my bristles, because I wanted to make sure that that last rectangle had that blue in a pretty light translucent state. Okay, so I'm finishing up here. I can definitely see a difference between all of my rectangles, and I was able to create a gradual transition from very dark and saturated phthalo blue to very light and very translucent phthalo blue. So this exercise gives us a great opportunity to practice water control and also, of course, an understanding of how we're able to develop a wide range of values using just one same color. I cannot recommend this exercise enough. You can practice going from dark to light like we did today. You can go from light to dark. And you can even challenge yourself later to create value strips with up to 8 or 10 little rectangles. Okay, so right here you can see how I've marked out what would be the midtones in this little value strip that I've created. I pointed out the darkest value on the left, which has less water in it, and I pointed out the lightest value on the right, which has more water in it. All right, moving on to the next part of this video, in which I'm going to be explaining important terminology or vocabulary pertaining to light behavior. These are going to help you know what to look for when you have something in front of you in real life, or you're looking at a reference photo and you're really trying to pinpoint those different values so that you can make them happen in your drawings or paintings. If you incorporate these different shadow and light areas into your drawings or paintings, it's a lot more likely that your object or the subject that you're drawing or painting is going to look a lot more 3D, a lot more realistic. And even when you're drawing or painting something from imagination that you're trying to make look believable, like what I am doing today with these spheres, if you bring these things in, you're likely going to arrive at more believable results. Okay, so these 7 key sections are the highlight, the area of direct light, the terminator, the core shadow, the section of reflected light, the cast shadow, and the occlusion shadow. Okay, so I'm going to draw in all of these sections in this first sphere so that I can explain what each of these is. So let's just say that there is one single light source hitting these spheres from somewhere above these spheres and to the right of them. This means that the lightest light or the brightest highlight in the sphere is going to be somewhere near its upper right edge, because the light source is hitting the object from that direction, and it is the one point in the object or subject where that light source is hitting the object directly. In other words, it's the very lightest area of the form. An interesting fact about highlights is that because they are actually reflections, they are going to move depending on our vantage point in relation to the object. So what I mean is the light hits the object and the object bounces back that light to our eyes. And so if we move a little bit to the left or to the right, or get a little bit lower or higher, that highlight is going to slightly move on that object. Highlights are basically where that light hits and gets reflected or bounced back to our eyes, rather than being absorbed by the object. And of course, how much light gets bounced off the object and how much light gets absorbed by the object is really going to vary depending on the object's characteristics and its surface qualities. Highlights and light value areas are super important to acknowledge as artists working with watercolor, because we are bringing in the whiteness and the brightness of the paper to stand in place for our highlights and to help us create lighter value areas, because we're using translucent or transparent color in those areas, and transparent color in combination with the brightness of the paper underneath is going to help us create those lightest values, right? If we don't plan for our highlights and keep them protected throughout the painting process, that's going to be an issue, because we're going to get rid of that whiteness and brightness of the paper, and we're going to get rid of that lightest value. And that is going to lead to flatness. And yes, of course, that highlight is going to become smaller and smaller as I move through my painting process, but I'm going to make sure that at the end, I at least have some amount of whiteness of paper shining through, left uncovered, left unpainted. Okay, so let's move on to the terminator. This line that I've created right here is the terminator. So what is this? This is the line that divides the light section of the sphere from the shadow section of the sphere. So on one side of the terminator, in this case it's on the right, these are the planes of the sphere which are getting affected by the light. The sections of the sphere that the light is actually able to reach. And all of that section of the sphere that the light is able to reach around the highlight is known as the section of direct light. And opposite to that, on the other side of the terminator, in this case, it's the left. Those are the planes that the light is not able to reach directly. So in other words, the terminator separates the two general light and shadow zones. And it's located just before the planes of the object start to face away from the light. Okay, so moving on to the core shadow. So the core shadow is usually a band-like shape that wraps around the structure of the object. You're gonna find it in a lot of curved objects like these spheres. And it's the darkest value area inside of the form. The core shadow is the darkest section in the object where the light and shadow areas meet right along the terminator. And this is the darkest section inside of the form because it is right in the spot where that light can no longer reach the form in order to illuminate it. And it is also darkest because there is no reflected light being bounced off from the surface under the object. Okay, so moving on to reflected light. In all of these spheres, you're gonna notice that I try to create a little bit of a lighter value along the edge opposite to the light. And this is because usually, especially with curved objects like this, you're gonna have some amount of reflected light created by light hitting the surface that the object is on, and the surface bounces back light onto the object. And how much light the surface beneath the object is able to bounce back on the object is going to again depend on the surface qualities and also the color of the surface that the object is on. Even though the light from the light source cannot reach the planes of the object facing away from it, it can certainly reach the surface that the object is on, as well as other surfaces of other objects around it. And these surfaces and objects are bouncing back light onto the object. All right, and finally we have the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow. So right here, you're gonna see me add two different shapes. One of them is a larger shape and the other one is a smaller shape inside of the larger shape near the object. The larger shape is the cast shadow shape, and inside of it is a smaller shape closer to the object, and that is the occlusion shadow. So the cast shadow is the shadow that the object creates on the surface it's on. So the little form, the three-dimensional structure, is blocking that light from hitting a section of the surface it's on. And also something important to take note of is that the shape of the cast shadow is going to be informed by or created by the shape and also the size of the subject or the object itself. And the occlusion shadow is usually a darker area that you're able to see within the larger cast shadow shape. It lies immediately beneath the form and it's darkest because the form is blocking the light almost entirely, and this one section closest to the object is not getting affected by any reflected light either. Okay, so now that you know about all of these important light and shadow areas, I want to challenge you to look for these in your future reference photos that you're using or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life. And depending on the light situation and the environment situation and everything, there's so many different variables that can affect what you're able to see in terms of these different areas, how subtle they are, etc. But try to look for them. Okay, now you know what to look for. And if you find them, try to make them happen in your drawing or painting. And oftentimes, even if the artist is not able to find something or it's very subtle, they actually enhance that section darken it even more, or lighten it even more to really make something look more 3D. But they know about these different areas and they strategically enhance those values to create more 3D-ness and dimension if they're not able to see them or certain sections are super subtle. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just add in a little shape for my highlights and also the larger cast shadow shape in these three other spheres. Now that I have explained all of these areas, I'm not going to be drawing all of these different areas in all of my spheres because I don't want to see my pencil work through my lighter values and my gradients that I'm going to be creating. But do know that I have all of these sections in mind as I go ahead and start developing my different values. Okay, so just finishing up here, and when I am done, I'm going to be taking my Sharpie and labeling each of these 4 spheres with the specific method or technique that I'm going to be using to shade them in, specifically in terms of how I'm going to be using color in each. So the first sphere, I am going to be shading in monochromatically, meaning I am going to use only one same color to create my different values. So one same color in the variety of values that that same color allows. And honestly, I cannot recommend working monochromatically or doing monochromatic studies enough for beginners just getting started with their learning of light behavior and creating a sense of 3D form and depth and dimension. Why? Because you're using just one same color value scale as opposed to using multiple colors, which essentially make it so that you have to work with a variety of color scales. And when you're able to develop a sense of three-dimensional form using just one same color, it makes it a lot easier for you to then transition to using a variety of colors. Okay, the second sphere, I am going to be using the analogous method, which means that I'm going to be using 2 colors that are next to each other in the color wheel to develop my different values. For the third sphere, I'm going to be using a set of 2 complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors that are opposite to each other in the color wheel. And finally, the last sphere is going to be painted in using the glazing technique. So this means that I'm going to be using more than one layer to develop my different values. When I am working on watercolor pieces, I quite often make use of both analogous colors and complementary colors to create both the hues that I am looking for and the values that I am looking for. And I also quite often make use of glazing. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the very first sphere. And I'm going to be using just one single color. So in this case, I'm going to be using the same blue that I used for my value strip exercise, which is my phthalo blue. And I'm going to be using just one same size 12 round brush for all of these spheres. Okay, so what I like doing when I'm working with watercolor is I always like getting started from my lightest color and I make my way incrementally towards my darker color. And especially when I'm painting on paper that is dry, meaning I haven't pre-wetted my paper with clean water before dropping in my paint, I always like getting started with very light, pale, watered down, translucent color, and I build upon that. So that's exactly what you're seeing me do right now. I went in with my phthalo blue in a very watered down state. I placed a small amount of paint in this shape, avoiding that highlight section. So I'm leaving the highlight section completely dry and unpainted so that I can have a little bit more control. And so that that paint doesn't expand into that highlight area and cover it up as I am painting. But as you can see, I'm painting in the entire shape, avoiding the highlight section, and it looks very light, very pale. After having placed some amount of that phthalo blue, I went in with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush, and I'm running my paintbrush bristles all throughout this area at least 5 to 6 times or so. Not only so that I can soften that color and lighten the value of that blue a little bit more, but also so that that shape remains wet and workable so that I have time to develop all of the values that I'm going to be working on next. Because otherwise, because I'm painting on dry paper, that paper is going to dry pretty quickly and you're not going to be left with smooth, gradual transitions between your different values. So take your time with that first layer of lightest pale blue. And then once you've arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout, and no section is starting to dry too fast, then go ahead and start sculpting that sphere. So with my first pale layer of translucent blue in, and with that nice even sheen all throughout the sphere, except for of course the highlight area, I took a little bit more of that phthalo blue in a slightly less watered down state from the center of my puddle there, and I then started dropping in this phthalo blue in the left side of the sphere, so on the left side of the terminator, which is of course the shadow side. So my intention was to start developing darker values on the shadow side. Now, of course, because we're working with watercolor and the shape, except for the highlight, is still pretty wet, well, obviously that paint is going to start expanding into the light side, but that's perfectly okay. That's what I want, because I want to create that transition, right, like a gradient, in which blue midtones turn gradually into lighter blue values. Once I had a good amount of color on the shadow side of the sphere and started to develop those midtones, I then just helped those transitions happen a little bit more smoothly by running my paintbrush bristles in between the midtones and the lighter value sections, very minimally and very gently. Once I'm happy with these blue midtones that I've started developing and I'm happy with those transitions into lighter values, it is now time to take a little bit more paint and start placing paint now only in the core shadow shape. So the darkest value shape within that form that I was talking about before is what I am looking to darken now. Now, as you can see, this paint that I am laying down right now in the core shadow, it's bleeding out organically along the edges because the paper is still pretty wet and workable. If I had painted in that initial layer super quickly and hadn't taken time to make sure that I ran my paintbrush bristles over that entire shape a few times in the beginning, I would already have partially dry sections and I wouldn't be able to continue working the way that I am. So by having taken my time with that initial lightest, most translucent layer, I not only made it so that that water content on my paper is helping me with smoother, softer transitions between my different value shapes, but I also bought myself more time and I don't feel like I have to constantly race against the clock. All right, so after having placed more of that phthalo blue along the core shadow to darken the core shadow shape, and having helped transition that darker midtone into lighter values once again, very softly, very gently with my paintbrush, I am now depositing even more of my phthalo blue, once again focusing on the core shadow band wrapping around the sphere. At this point, I'm really only looking to darken darkest value areas, and I'm protecting the lighter midtones and the lightest lights. But as with all of the previous layers of paint, I am really mindfully placing just a small amount of paint on my paper, and then once I feel I've placed enough paint, it's just a matter of doing a little bit more work, whether it's pushing that paint around on my paper that I just placed, smoothing out transitions, doing some lifting with either my absorbent towel or the bristles of my paintbrush. I can also use the bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge. Whenever I feel I've placed way too much paint somewhere or I've flattened out an area a little bit too much, I go in and do some lifting, lighten an area back up. A lot of this process is going to be me just going in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush to gently move that paint around that has already been placed on paper. As long as your paint is still wet and workable, you can go in and soften transitions and do whatever work it is that you need to do. This said, I would be super careful not to go in with too much water in your paintbrush, because you can create back runs if you all of a sudden go in with too much water and too much water starts dripping down onto paint that is kind of already on your paper and starting to dry. But anyway, every time that I place more paint on paper, I am looking to amplify the range of values that I've developed. Once I have amplified that range of values a little bit with that new placement of color, I then ask myself if I can go ahead and start adding more to deepen and darken certain sections within that and continue sculpting the sphere. Take note of how frequently I'm dabbing the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel that I have right there on my left to stay on top of water control and also to remove excess paint from my paintbrush bristles whenever I feel I've already placed enough paint. I also use it to remove excess water from my paintbrush bristles if I just dip my paintbrush in my container of water and can run the risk of just depositing way too much water on my paper. Right here you can see me do some lifting with the clean and slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush to lift up some excess paint along that reflected light section that I wanted to lighten back up in the back portion of the sphere. If you don't want the color inside of your sphere and the color for your cast shadow and occlusion shadow shapes to merge together, I would highly recommend allowing that sphere to dry completely before painting in these sections. And what I'm gonna do right here is I'm gonna start painting in the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow. So I just went in initially with a light pale translucent phthalo blue there, and I'm painting in the entire cast shadow shape. Ran my paintbrush bristles along that entire shape a couple of times to ensure that it remained wet, and then dropped in a little bit more of my phthalo blue in the occlusion shadow nearest the object that I wanted to darken more. Right here I'm going to place even more paint, and you can see how, because I took time to paint that initial lightest blue, that new placement of color, it bled out and created nice soft blurred out transitions into lighter values within that cast shadow. And finally, to finish up, I softened some sections of edges along the highlight shape. So because we left the highlight shape dry and we have been working around it, then probably you're left with sharp defined edges. And if you want to soften those edges, all you have to do is go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, gently do a little bit of scrubbing along some sections of those edges, and then just go ahead and dab your absorbent towel in that section that you just scrubbed, and that should lighten that color and soften those edges. All right, you guys, it's time to get started with the second sphere, and this one is going to be the sphere that we're painting in with analogous colors. So as I said in the beginning, analogous colors are colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. They can be pairs of colors or groups of 3 colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. So I decided to go with orange and red for this one. If you're interested in knowing exactly the colors that I am using Hansa Yellow Deep for my orange, which, yes, in name it is yellow, but it's a very warm yellow that looks more orange than yellow, so I picked that one. And then for my red, I am using Pyrrole Scarlet. I made sure to remove all of the blue from my paintbrush bristles in order not to pollute these colors. That's super important. But the process is gonna be exactly the same, really. I am working on this first layer of very pale, translucent light orange, working around that highlight so that I can make sure that the highlight is kept protected. And I am making sure to run my paintbrush bristles along the entire shape so that I can keep it wet and workable for way longer. And then, just like with the first sphere, I'm gonna make my way incrementally towards darker values. But this time we're using 2 different colors. So my next value is going to be created with a mixture of orange and red. You can see on my paint mixing palette, I have orange on one side, I have my red on the other side, and in the middle of the 2, I have a mixture of both. So this is a red orange. So that is the color that I'm using right now to get started with my midtones. And just like with the first one, I got started with visualizing that terminator and placing the majority of this next darker color on the opposite side to the light source on the left of that terminator. And as I move into darker values, I am adding more red into that mixture to darken it more. Once I was happy with the darker midtones that I've developed and also the transitions, I then added a little bit more red into that color mixture, and I am now looking to only darken the core shadow shape. So I'm doing that same process of moving incrementally towards darker values as best as I can, adding a little bit of paint and doing some sculpting. And I am working on my sculpting exactly the same way that I did with the first sphere. I am continuing to work on transitions between my different values, helping those colors merge together a little bit more softly and gradually. I am doing lifting wherever I feel I've placed way too much color, or I feel I need to lighten a section back up to add more dimension, or I need to add more paint, I go ahead and do that. So right here, after having created my lighter values, my wide range of midtones, and having started my work on my darkest values, I then went ahead and started adding just pure red along that core shadow shape. So that's the darkest value that I wanted to develop. Right here, I am lightening some sections right around the highlight that I feel got a little bit too dark. And at the same time, I start softening those edges. I then drop in a little bit more of my lighter orange in the section closest to the highlight because I feel I've lifted up way too much paint, but just pay attention to which color you should be dropping in. If you want to add more color into a lighter area, well, you have to make sure that it's the orange. If it's a mid-tone, then a red-orange is okay. And if you want to darken the core shadow, which is the darkest value, then make sure that it's your red. I continue helping myself with my absorbent towel to do lifting and dabbing to remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles. And I lift and I dab and I lift and I dab. I'm continuing to work on the sculpting of this sphere mindfully and intentionally, and always making sure that I'm having in mind all of those different light and shadow sections that I talked about in the beginning of this video. Right here, you're gonna see me drop in a little bit more of that lighter orange because I once again feel I've lifted up way too much paint right around the highlight section, and I just lightened up way too big of a section around the highlight area. Then I'm gonna soften out some little textures and lines that I see in the highlight shape, doing some lifting with my absorbent towel, and then all I'm gonna be missing is painting in the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow. So what's super cool about using analogous colors to do your shading or value development is that your color is always going to be super vibrant. Whenever analogous colors mix together or create gradients into each other, whether they are purple and blue or green and yellow, or any two colors that are analogous, those are always going to look very vibrant and very bright. Whereas when we use complementary colors mute each other out. They desaturate each other. And if you mix enough of them together, you're gonna start creating browns and grays. And that's what we're gonna be seeing in the next sphere. And now I'm getting started with painting in the section of cast shadow and occlusion shadow. So initially I go in with the lighter orange in a pretty watered down state. And then with that initial cast shadow shape painted in, I go ahead and drop in my second color, which was the mixture of my orange and my red. And I drop that color into the occlusion shadow section nearest to the sphere. All right, it's time to get started with the third sphere. And for this one, we're gonna be using complementary colors. And I decide to go with green and red, which are opposites in the color wheel. If you're interested in knowing exactly which colors it is that I used for this little sphere, I used Viridian Green for my green and I used Deep Scarlet for my red. So essentially my sphere is going to be red, but I am going to be creating darker red values by mixing some green into that red. So right here on this section of my color mixing palette, you can see how I have red on one side, green on the other side, and I am mixing the two together in between. You can see in the middle where I mixed the green into the red that I've developed darker red values. So I'm getting started right here with that initial layer of color. So my red in a pretty translucent state is what I'm using right now to paint in that initial shape, avoiding the highlight section that I want to keep protected and dry and free of color. Just like with the others, I am taking my time with this initial layer so that I can make sure that everything stays nice and wet for longer. Once I am done with this initial layer, I'm going to take some of that red that has a bit of green in it, and just like with the others, I'm going to start darkening the section or the side opposite to the light source on the left side of the terminator. That's what I'm visualizing right here, the terminator. Remember, the more green you add into your red, the darker you're gonna get it. So if you're still working on lighter midtones and you're making your way incrementally towards your darker values, then you're gonna add a little bit of green first, then more as you move on to developing your deeper, darkest values. Once I've darkened that section, I can add a little bit more green into my mixture to darken it even more. You can see how nice, deep, and dark that is. And I am looking to only deepen and darken the core shadow shape. So you can see how this mixture of complementary colors really created a very dark, rich, deep color there for my core shadow. It looks almost brownish or grayish even. Notice the range of values that I was able to develop in this sphere versus the range of values that I was able to develop in the analogous color sphere. Because I was able to create such a deep, rich, dark color by mixing together the two complementaries, in this case red and green, I was able to create very dark values. Whereas with the analogous color scheme, I kind of stayed, I was able to create a wide range of values, but I was only able to get so dark with just the red. Of course, that's going to depend on the pair of analogous colors that you choose, because if you choose a very dark blue, then you're probably going to be able to create darker values of what I did there. But it's just something to have in mind. Complementary colors are going to allow you to create very deep, rich, dark colors. And because you're able to amplify that range of colors into very deep, dark values, you're really able to make something pop. So what you're seeing me do right here is just the sculpting, the same way that I worked on my sculpting with the previous spheres. I am doing lifting. Right here I'm doing lifting of that reflected light on the lower edge of that sphere, doing some softening of edges around the highlight shape, which is pretty stark looking right now. Those edges are pretty sharp. I am using my clean and slightly damp paintbrush and using my absorbent towel. And after doing my sculpting there, I'm going to get started with painting in the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow. Once again, starting with my lightest color, which in this case is the plain red. And then with that initial cast shadow, larger shape painted in, I'm going to go ahead and drop in the red with the little bit of green in it in the occlusion shadow area nearest the object to deepen and darken that area and create a range of values even in the shadow. All right, and with that, we're all done with the third sphere. And now we're moving into the glazing technique. So I am going to go with a purple, and I create this purple by mixing together ultramarine blue and pyrrole red. For this one, I'm going to keep it simple so that we can focus on practicing the layering, and we're just going to be using one same color. So pick whichever color you'd like. I would recommend though that it is medium to dark once again. Essentially, all glazing is working in layers. So what you're gonna see me do right here in many ways is exactly the same as what I've been doing with the other spheres. I am working from light to dark. I am placing just a bit of paint at a time, having all of the different light and shadow areas in mind as I am doing this. But essentially, I'm going to arrive at a point at which I allow that first layer of work to dry completely. And once everything is completely dry, I go ahead and add a second application of color in areas that I want to darken even further and leave all of the previous values shining through in areas of lighter values that I don't want to deepen and darken anymore. So right here, you can see me work on that first initial lightest pale layer of color. And right here, I'm going to go in with more of this purple, focusing on the section of shadow opposite to the light source on the left of the terminator. I'm going to do a little bit of lifting in that reflected light section on the lower left edge of this sphere. And then I'm going to paint in the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow. And once I'm done with this, I'm going to allow everything to dry completely, and I'm going to get to work on deepening and darkening the core shadow section with a subsequent layer of paint that I'm going to be developing after all of this has dried. Just finishing up with my shadow sections here, the same way I painted in the other ones. Okay, so everything is completely dry at this point. I'm going to go ahead and soften the edges of that highlight shape, which is very sharp and defined right now. And I'm just going in on dry paint and reactivating that paint with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, doing gentle scrubbing and quick lifting to soften those edges. And then it's going to be time to do my second layer of paint. So check it out. I'm making sure to go in with my purple in a relatively translucent state, and I'm only going to deepen and darken sections that are darkest value areas. So I'm focusing on darkening sections on the shadow side of the Terminator. I go in initially with my purple in a pretty watered down state because I want to take it incrementally towards my darkest values. And once everything is wet there, I go ahead and drop in more saturated purple, focusing on the core shadow shape. Remember that that is the shape of deepest, darkest values within the form. So I'm looking to darken that. Once I have a good amount of paint in there and I have achieved a darker look in that core shadow band shape, I go ahead and remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I soften those transitions a little bit more between my darkest values and my lighter midtones. Since I'm painting on paper that is dry, I'm going to be left with sharp defined edges around these darker shapes that I am painting in. So if I want to soften them, then all I have to do is remove that color from my paintbrush bristles and run my clean and damp bristles along the edges. And right here, I'm also going to darken the occlusion shadow shape a little bit more with another layer of paint. So the secret to doing glazing is just making sure that you're allowing the previous layer to dry completely before working on the next. And also, if you don't want to arrive at an overworked look, it is important that you only do the darkening or the addition of detail or whatever it is that you need to do in the sections that really require that, and leave all of the previous lighter value sections with no more paint added on top. Leave all of the previous beautiful lighter values that you've already developed alone with no more paint added on top. Because again, we're going for a range of values here, and if you just mindlessly start covering up those lighter value sections, well, you're going to get rid of those lighter values and you're going to flatten everything and you're going to make everything look heavy and overworked. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. Alright, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!